Anyone who first heard of the MTA would assume it was a non-profit trade organization. Although, technically, they wouldn't be wrong, that description was a huge understatement when considering the massive influence the transgalactic behemoth exerted on every corner of human space. They regulated the development, licensing, production, sale, and disposal of mechs. Pretty much the entire life cycle of a mech was in their purview, and they sometimes came to blows to enforce their self-proclaimed rights. Even a small and peaceful planet like Cloud Curtain had a local branch of the MTA. Both the Greater United Terran Confederation and the New Rubarth Empire acknowledged the powerful organization's supervisory powers. So, a small, third-rate state like the Bright Republic had no qualms about the MTA's forceful presence within its borders. The MTA established its branches wherever there was a sizable population of people. Lots of people meant that at least a handful of them could pilot mechs. If left alone, there was potential for them to get into trouble. So, the MTA made it a policy to supervise potentates regardless of whether they owned a mech. But an organization outside the control of any government entity should not have had the ability to meddle in the mech industry in the first place. Countless conspiracy theories made their way around the galactic net, each claiming to be the truth behind the creation of the MTA. A popular one suggested that the divisions in human space were not actually real. Every nation, from the smallest third-rate planet to the grandest first-rate superpower, was actually a different branch of the same tree. An organization known as the Shadow Council ruled humanity behind the scenes, and the MTA was merely its most visible arm. A less radical theory suggested the MTA was not as independent as people thought. Instead, it began in secret as a joint venture between the Terrans and the Rubarthans. Despite their intense rivalry, they shared enough common interest to regulate the mech industry and founded the MTA to bend the military strength of other nations to their will. The MTA's existence and the stringent enforcement of its principles had brought the unregulated mech trade to its knees. These principles prevented the incorporation of weapons of mass destruction into the arsenal of mechs. They curbed widespread corporate espionage and gave smaller mech businesses a chance to thrive by encouraging the practice of licensing more obscure designs. The introduction of these benefits meant not everyone saw the creation of the MTA as a negative thing. What affected Vez the most were the strict standards the MTA applied to public mech sales. Any mech traded in an open transaction was required to be certified by the MTA before it received a stamp of approval. Without this approval, the mech designer was deprived of an independent, trustworthy assessment of their product, which basically meant no one would dare purchase that product. But the practice was voluntary, and companies were free to sell their mechs without involving the MTA if they made their transactions private. This most often happens with next-generation, cutting-edge designs involving top enterprises and government entities. Vez was too small a player to engage in such high-level transactions, so he meekly submitted his mech to the MTA for their standard certification. With Lucky perched on his shoulder, he exited the transit shuttle and stepped onto the paved landing pad next to the Cloud Curtain branch of the MTA. The supervisor was waiting for him on the steps leading up to the complex. Vez held out his hand and introduced himself. Vez Larkinson. Hello, Mr. Larkinson. My name is Ryan Baldwin. Ryan was a dark-skinned man with a robust posture. He shook Vez's hand and led him up the stairs. Welcome to the MTA. I must admit, when I heard a designer wanted to submit a newly fabricated mech to our branch, we were at a loss for a moment. Vez chuckled amiably at the remark. I'm the only mech manufacturer on this planet, right? Yep. The most we do is bust heads and lend a hand against pirates. We have hardly any mech technicians on site qualified to certify your mech. My apologies for inconveniencing you. Can the certification process still proceed? I'm kind of pressed for time. No worries, son. Unless our branch is in the middle of nowhere. We always have a senior technician on hand. They entered the quiet and spacious building complex and walked through the halls until they came to the entrance of a large workshop area. A cranky-looking middle-aged lady in coveralls greeted them with a suspicious look. Vez, let me introduce you to Gertrude Samuelson. The woman in question crossed her arms.
So, you're the brat messing up my maintenance schedule. I had a system in place, you know. Now I have to waste precious hours testing your toy. You better not think it's a done deal because I'll be doing my best to dig up its flaws.
Vez could do nothing but smile awkwardly. He had spent an excessive amount of time building up the Phoenix Cry, and he was confident his mech could pass all but the most stringent of tests. The more extensive assessments would never be applied to a regular commercial mech, so he had nothing to worry about. At least, that was what he hoped. The three entered the cavernous workshop, where a handful of mechs were undergoing routine maintenance. At the end of the stables rested the Phoenix Cry, freshly transported from his workshop. A couple of junior technicians were already scurrying around its chassis with several handheld instruments.
Seeing as you're so young, this must be your first certification, right?
Yes, but I'm familiar with the steps.
Good. Then you know that you'll just have to stand there and do nothing while I pick apart all its issues.
Gertrude stepped behind a console and activated a thick, mechanical arm. Vez recognized the device as an advanced sensor capable of penetrating through almost any material. The woman operated the arm carefully, bringing it over the feet of the man. The display in front of her brought up a cross-section of the area she was scanning, along with multiple technical readouts that Vez barely understood.
Looks fine so far. It seems you didn't screw up the proportions when you made the HRF armor plating. Lots of newbies trip themselves up when they work with such a highly refined material. A deviance of 0.1% at the beginning could be amplified to as much as 10% by the time the HRF rolls off the fabricators.
I didn't rush the process. I'm confident the rest of my mech is equally as sturdy.
We'll see about that.
Gertrude diligently scanned the mech from top to bottom and front to back. The sensor swiveled from side to side, covering every square inch of the machine. But to no avail. Vez understood enough of the readouts to see that none of the armor or internal components showed any significant deviations from the blueprint. Any flaws detected so far were within tolerance according to the MTA's official guidelines. Only the most nitpicky of technicians would choose to make an issue out of them. Although her frown deepened, Gertrude said nothing. After completing her scans, she moved on to the next part of the inspection.
Let's see if your internals perform as advertised.
This was an area Vez was less confident of. It was fairly easy to spot any structural damage, but without actually piloting the mech, it was much harder to determine if the components he had fabricated would perform on spec. As the technicians scurried away from the chassis, a young pilot entered the cockpit. Vez, Ryan, and Gertrude watched at a safe distance as the mech was activated. The neural interface is starting up without a hitch. No issues encountered so far. The pilot's voice came through clearly, and Gertrude confirmed his initial observations on the readings that scrolled down her terminal. Startup finished. The mech is in standby mode. The power reactor is spinning. No leaks detected. Temperature is normal.
Do you hear any weird noises?
It's quiet so far. Want me to engage the engines?
Hold up. I still want to test out its power management. Run some power through the wrist-mounted laser cannons. Charge up its capacitors. Make sure the weapons remain safe before you do that, though.
Vez and Lucky watched on as Gertrude tried her hardest to uncover a fault. But no matter how much she stressed the power system, the mech would not squeal. Despite 2 hours of testing, not one complaint could be found. The engines purred like a kitten, and the sensors were able to capture objects from miles away with laser-like accuracy. Vez first smiled and then grinned widely as he realized he had nothing to fear about the internals. His mech was mechanically sound.
Let's move on to the active tests.
Vez could hear the annoyance in Gertrude's voice. She grumbled to herself as the pilot took the mech outside to a large range and obstacle course.
Please subscribe to the Pocket FM YouTube channel and press the bell icon for instant notification. Check out our channel for more such exciting shows.